Today's session will be a departure from the usual presentation given. Susan Lyons, president of Designtex, will moderate a discussion between John Hamilton, director of global design for Coalesse and of surface materials for Steelcase, and Catherine Stoll, design director of Designtex. Ahead of their time and the pandemic, these individuals of sister companies managed to design fabrics, patterns specifically for Coalesse, while only meeting once in person and the rest done remotely. Exploring how like-minded creatives can share the process to deliver a successful product will be a fascinating journey. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Susan Lyons.
Thank you, Beth. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. So we're very excited to share this project with you. And I am joined here by two individuals who made this project happen. First, welcome John Hamilton, who is an industrial designer and director of design for Steelcase, as you heard, at Coalesse and Turnstone, as you heard from Beth. John's work, I would say, is characterized by a real appreciation for craft and how craft and industry kind of come together, and also a lovely attention to detail. So you'll hear lots of great stuff from John. And then Catherine Stoll, who is the design director for Designtex. Catherine is trained in textile design, and her work, I would say, combines performance and aesthetics in a beautiful marriage. And she has a real artist's eye for color. So you'll hear more from Catherine as we go along. So I'm going to just turn it over to the two of them and first ask how this project actually came about. What were you trying to do and why were you trying to do it? John?
I was thinking Catherine was going to start. I think the project started through just some nice conversations that we were all having about the partnership, about the fact that we work for a company, for a larger company that has a series of sub-brands, underneath it, and how we could take advantage of that, how we could work together and create things that gave us an unfair advantage when compared to companies who don't have such a relationship. And we kind of in our discussions got to the point where I think we felt that if we, when designing the furniture pieces, had fabrics that were designed specifically to work best on them, it could give our products a little bit of a differentiation and a little bit of an advantage. And I think then also when we were thinking about the fabrics that we wanted to develop, we were thinking, how could we develop those fabrics where they could specifically work best on some of our pieces? And we weren't trying to do anything that it made it to where you couldn't use other fabrics or that those fabrics wouldn't work on anything else. It was just that when those two things were married together, they were even better. So it was kind of this idea of 1 + 1 = 3 versus the traditional 2. And it was just a kind of nice synergy, a nice conversation that I think everyone started to see the opportunity in, and led to this what I believe to be a really wonderful outcome.
Yeah,
I think Catherine, often. Yeah, sorry, jump in.
No, I feel like we're sister, Coalesse and Designtex are sort of sister companies, and parts of our companies work together all the time, but our design studios hadn't kind of worked on a design project together. So taking Coalesce's point of view around, fitting the pattern and material to the form, and our point of view around, focusing on the material was kind of a self-made project, but it was fun to do. And we hadn't worked together that way before, I don't think.
Catherine, when you're generally designing for the Designtex collection, are you specifically thinking about context and where the products will go? But in this case, it seemed very specific. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that might have been a different experience?
Yeah, that's usually when we're designing materials, you have your audience in mind and you kind of make groups of types of things where your product could be used. But we don't design the furniture. We're really making material to be used on, oh, this would be nice in a public space. So what would that look like and what does it need to do? Or this could be a task chair material, but of all the task chairs. So working specifically with the Coalesse suite of products in mind enabled us to get a lot more specific, I think, so that, and even have the opportunity to see things, rendered or, wrapped on the pieces already, which for us is a treat because we normally don't, that's not our decision to make typically. So it was kind of a nice opportunity to work that way.
The other thing that I found interesting was, when we started talking about our philosophies and how we approach the problems, and the things that we were thinking about, as brands, and this idea of craft and customization, and we were talking about biophilia. We're talking about a lot of just different design theories and approaches that we all, I think, kind of aligned on. It was kind of nice in a way where, as one started to talk about, hey, I'm interested in this, the other was, oh yeah, us too. And one of the things that I found was there were several techniques for production, and several thread types, and several smaller mills that we hadn't found the right project to do with them. And we both wanted to find a thing to do with them. And we wanted a fabric that was maybe more dimensional. We wanted a pattern that was maybe more abstract. And there were certain things that, as we talked conceptually, really felt like they aligned. And it just felt very natural to me of how we were thinking about what we wanted to have on our products, and that what you wanted to create as a thing to go onto products. And it was that kind of synergy, I think, that really led to why we did ultimately push through and do the project, because we just saw things in a very common way, a common light. It was nice.
Yeah, that is nice. And as Beth mentioned, I think in the intro, this was a pre-pandemic remote project undertaking, as a Coalesse studio was in San Francisco and the Designtex studio is in New York. So talk a little bit about how you got started. What was that process? What was the first sort of, how did you get to know each other?
Yeah, well,
better?
I think the first thing we did was, John, you came to New York with your team, and we all met in our studio, and we had just pulled, like you mentioned, a bunch of stuff just to have the conversation and say, here's the types of things we have. Is this interesting to you? This is a cool thing that hasn't found a home, like feels like something Coalesse might be interested in, material we don't normally use. And really kind of had like a little charrette around, is there something here that we'd want to do together in person? And that was really kind of the only in-person meeting that we had.
Yeah. And I think that seeing each other's studio is often nice too. It was very inspiring to come to the Designtex studio and see the things that the Designtex team plays with, the lab and the experiments that they have going on. And we have developed a palette, and we think about colors in a certain way. And one of the things that we were doing in developing our palette was really trying to pull from the things that were surrounding us. If you look at our palette and the colors that we were looking at, a lot of them come from the environment in California. You can look at the blues and you can reference the sky color here and the ocean color here, and you can look at the browns and the reds and the greens, and they really come from the landscape and the things that we were seeing around us. And it's interesting, as we came to New York, as much as it's the same sky, it has a different look and a different feel and a different blue than we often get. And I kind of liked that idea of coming and being inspired by something a little bit different, and then being able to take that back to where we were at. And now that you knew the person and you'd met them face to face, you'd had a coffee with them, it was much easier to have this conversation like we're having now through video, and really work the rest of the project through video, and in a way that at that time I think was rather new. We were using a shared document that we would both go into and edit together and add photos in, and we would do experiments and add them, and then they would do new color thread combinations and add them, and we would then have a meeting and talk about what had been added. And it was a very kind of, at that time, new way to work, but easy way to work. And now it seems kind of like a no doubt, I think everyone's working that way, and it's kind of ironic.
Yeah, well, Bailey on your team, John, she manned this like master Google Doc that we could just kept updating. And so some of the things, as John was mentioning, like how do we know each other, but we wanted to make sure, don't assume anything. So even on like the color principles, your team went through and said, like, this is an example of kind of like, okay, we like reds, but like not this pink, but yes to this red, or yes to this, desaturated blue, but no teal. So sort of putting out your preferences, I guess, is that the, around color, to also to kind of align on where you guys were looking at color and kind of what was on the table and what your kind of direction.
We were really trying to get to a shared mind. It was the process. Sometimes we'll do it even when we're talking about product and we're saying, more like a Jeep, less like a Mercedes, more like Levi's, less like, Armani. You have this thing so that it helps everyone get their mind of like, oh, I see, it's more camping and less, formal urban. And we were doing that with color. And so we were saying, we need a green, more like this green, less like that green. We need a blue, more like this blue, less like that blue. So it's not just blue, full saturation, the evaluation are considered in the hue, not really managed. It was very specific ones like, hey, we're playing in this family. We want, values in this kind of area. We want saturations in these kinds of ways. And we, you see, we went back and looked at, our specifications and where we often were seeing orders and the things that we were actually doing already. And we saw gaps. You could go through the whole spectrum like this, and we saw areas where we didn't have offerings, and we said, hey, let's try and find things that can fill in there and yet still feel natural to the rest of the palette that we've been creating.
It was a good group exercise with your team, John, like you said, to say, okay, what have we used before, and look at it, pull out all the colors and say, here's what we've been doing. Here's all the options. Where are the areas that we wouldn't normally go that we want to color wise, and then be specific about it. And the other thing, of this whole project is, and it's good to keep in mind sometimes, it is a product that has an audience that we want to use. So we want to make sure we cover our bases. Like, okay, if these warm neutrals or these gray neutrals are must-haves, you kind of lock those in, and then you find the areas where you're going to kind of use your voice and point of view to expand upon. So it has to be a balance of the things you need to have and the things you want to have.
It was interesting too, when we went back and we said, okay, well, let's look at what we do for ourselves. We took the orders that we placed for showrooms, for photo shoots, for any product that we were producing that we said, hey, we're going to use this for marketing reasons. And we actually found a fairly narrow bandwidth. We were like, wow, you can see we had preferences. And that's where we said, let's make ourselves a little bit more uncomfortable. Let's go outside of some of those things that we traditionally would do and build on that to give ourselves some more bandwidth. And you can see some of that here. And we started looking at combinations and how we could go a little bit wider than we traditionally been, yet still have the neutrals and the warms and those things that are inviting and something that people hopefully would be drawn to.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I love the level of detail that you went through to get there. Talk a little bit about how you chose the types of qualities or constructions or the types of textiles that you were drawn to.
I would say some of our point of view for this project around this started from that initial conversation, John, and talking about how your team was interested in like tailored details and smaller makers and more specialty manufacturers and even natural fibers that have, really specific about the hand of the fabric. So that kind of, I would say, guided us into like what, because, Designtex has a wide range of products. We work on, all sorts of markets using all sorts of materials. But as we were sort of talking, then in the studio, we're grabbing like, oh, this in this image here is like a quilted construction that we had been, playing around with, but weren't really sure what to do with it. Or we pulled out some, linen fiber references just to kind of say like, oh, does this, feel like a good match?
I think we also wanted some boundaries. We wanted to be able to go from casual to formal. And so to have something that felt very soft and almost more from a residential kind of aesthetic to something that was almost like a suit and more tailored and tighter and could work in locations that might not be as accepting to something that's so casual. And so we wanted a linen, and we wanted something that was a melange type of sensibility. We wanted things that were natural fibers that one would want to touch, and if not, then it wanted to have a story about recyclability or where it came from. And so we were very deliberate in kind of the techniques and the fibers that we were going to use and the patterns that we were trying to kind of promote that would be a part of each of those things.
And I know Designtex and Coalesse share a strong history and belief in sustainable product development. So speak a little bit about this particular construction that you developed.
Yeah, so the yellow swatch on the right-hand side is the final textile that we did. And this was part of those conversations of saying, here's the tools we have in our toolbox as material designers that we get to play with. And this one in particular is the construction is what's really interesting. It's a platform that Designtex has developed in coordination with Steelcase, one of our weaving mills, and a yarn manufacturer. And we kind of call it our closed loop platform. So it's a yarn platform that we can weave whatever we want with and do different constructions. We said, we have this special thing, would we want to use it? And essentially the yarn that's in it comes from, it's a fully closed loop cycle. So we use recycled plastic water bottles as yarn all the time. But in this case, and you kind of see it in this diagram on the left-hand side, Steelcase, which is manufacturing furniture, but has offcuts of the fabric that they use when they're making that. So the salvages get discarded as waste. So they saved those for a really long time for us. And then we worked with a yarn manufacturer to make those back into a yarn. And in this image and in our constructions, it's a black yarn because the product going into the yarn is different colors. It's fabric waste. So we dye it a black so it kind of can include all of that waste. And then we weave it with regular recycled polyester, which is white and can be dyed different colors into a new fabric. So it's a fully closed loop where you're taking offcuts of manufacturing waste and reintroducing them into a higher value product. So that's a construction we used for this matelassé construction using one of Coalesce's patterns.
The thing that I love too in some of these things is that sense of kind of perfectly imperfect. You see these patterns and you see kind of how the wrinkles or those puckers can present themselves. And in many constructions, you want the thing to be so consistent. You want the lines to show up exactly in the point that you'd planned them. You want that when you then sew something together, those things will marry each other in exactly the right way. And in a construction like that, we didn't want that. We wanted to allow the imperfection of the material itself, the weaving of it, and the construction of it to be a part that you celebrate. And it's one of the positives to me about it is that, it is this thing that in some ways you almost don't know what you're going to get, but you kind of do. And that's what makes it perfect, is its imperfection. And it makes, I think, the thing even better.
remember in the development, there was a case where we had, those pleats come out and you can't control them perfectly, like you're saying, in the dyeing process, and having conversations with the manufacturing plant explaining, they're trying to iron them out. And we were saying, no, it's supposed to be that way. And that's one of the benefits of working together on a project like this, where you can have that conversation ahead of time, all the way down the line to, who's upholstering the fabric and saying, why won't this lie flat? And we're like, no, it's supposed to be.
When we first made the samples, the very first products, the plant was trying to pull it as tight as they could to try and get all the wrinkles out. And they were calling us saying, we have a problem with your fabric. And we're like, no, you don't. It's not supposed to be the way that traditionally, because they wanted it flat and perfect and tight. And we were like, no, we want it wrinkly and imperfect and great. And it took some real work to get them to understand that. And then how to create a document that, helped the people in the plant understand what the quality expectation was and how to continually achieve that. How do you achieve, consistently imperfect, and know how much imperfect is okay. That was another road that we had to kind of navigate as well.
Yeah, that seems like a nice outcome of this, that you really had control over really the experience of the product all the way through to when it arrives to the client. But talk a little bit, you mentioned, John, about biophilia at the beginning, and talk a little bit about in terms of pattern exploration, how you think about that at Coalesse, and how you use nature's principles in your process.
Yeah, and you've seen a couple images as been flashing through. One of the things that we had a lot of discussions about and we really like is this idea of micro to macro, where there's these micro patterns that are happening that sometimes you don't even notice as you move through nature. And then there's, these very macro patterns that, you observe and maybe you're more conscious of. And you're taking things like a piece of burnt wood and, scanning it and then blowing it up to, something like this, to where you can't tell that it's actually the grain of the wood and where it's been burnt. And then when you actually shrink it back down, you can see that again. It's almost like a Chuck Close painting or something like that, where sometimes you don't see these, circular colored spots if you're close up to it, but as you back away, all of a sudden you see the face. And we liked that, and we liked that kind of abstraction that you could get by moving in and out from the pieces. And as you got closer to a piece of furniture and the fabric itself, you experienced it in a different way. And some of these things were grains of wood, or the way that water would leave a pattern on sand as the waves wash in. Some of them were fractals from, crystals or the skin of snakes. And, we really pulled from a lot of images and things that we were seeing around us to try and develop a series of patterns that we felt we could then play out into the weaving itself, or, the printing on the fabric. And, that's what you see represented in a lot of these, pictures, is that play between the micro and the macro, and those biophilic patterns that we were being inspired by.
And Catherine, I think Designtex also works often with biophilic principles as well. So you were very familiar with those ideas, also a nice kind of coming together of like minds.
Yeah, no, it was a nice synergy, and having the underpinning of those principles in the pattern, even if you don't recognize it right away, we know has a benefit. So that was fun.
Yeah, we had a lot of feedback from people that, you couldn't, I would say, exactly correlate to what we'd done, but at the same time, it was the only thing that had been changed or that was different, and yet they were responding to it. So you'd get comments like, I don't know why I like this so much, but I really like it. Or I don't know why I choose that piece of furniture to sit on or that space to be in, but there's something about it that I really respond to. And, it was often, I think, that their brain was responding to some of the biophilic principles and patterns and references that were being pulled in, not only the color, but the patterns itself in the weaving, and actually the way the objects were composed with each other. And it's when you combine all of those things, I think, that you can create spaces that people maybe, on the surface don't realize why they like it so much. But, those things that are built into us that we're programmed with on how to respond to nature, and that our brain understands better than we do, they do respond to. And I think that really is something that you see in these fabrics. And you see this thing, it says it didn't translate. We tried a lot of patterns that I'd say didn't work. And one of the things that we took a lot of time in trying to do is say how micro and how macro, let's try and put that pattern on furniture and how it gets upholstered. And then let's talk about whether we think it's successful or not. And there were a lot of times where we put it on and we said, it's not very successful. We don't like what it's doing. And then there's other times when we put it on, it's like, oh, that's just about right. Look, it's the way that the pattern's repeating in too much of a density or too little of a density that we didn't respond to. And when it hit the right kind of composition, we said, as you can see in these, it didn't feel right. But as we manipulated the pattern to different scales, you could start to find it where you're like, now it's starting to read and feel more comfortable. And I think visually you want it to be as comfortable as the thing is physically comfortable. And so as you approached it, you want people to look at it and go, I want to try that. I want, it visually drew them in and didn't kind of vibrate almost in a way that you'd be like, wow, that's too much for me. I don't want to sit on that thing. And we played a lot with that. As you can see that we would move through these different quiltings and printings and different ways of getting a pattern to try and understand how it would then be applied and whether that worked on the objects that we wanted to apply it to. You can see those ones didn't work.
It was a little bit of a Goldilocks situation, right?
Yeah,
too
really
big, too small, just right. Talk a little bit about this process, Catherine. What's happening here?
Sure. Well, one of the things in our kind of look back at what we had been doing was we had this heathered wool that I think was kind of a Coalesse like go-to fabric. Ours is called Heather, and it was used all the time. And we thought, oh, is there a way we could use this construction, this pressed wool construction, as a platform for pattern, with their suite of products in mind. So you do trials and you play around, and this ability and this level of detail to try it on the actual furniture in a virtual setting was super informative. So here was an example where we wove this pattern that came from their pattern exploration into the wool construction, and really found immediately that the line weight was way too heavy, as you could see in those images, and all of us were like, oh no. And that led us to trying out both a micro and a macro scale of the pattern, but keeping the line weight the same. So here you can see them upholstered together, where the macro we went really, really big. And the micro was much smaller, but we kept the line weight the same. So they still felt like they could be used together, which was a really cool idea from your team, John, of the idea of like using these patterns in conjunction, even on the same piece of furniture.
Yeah.
And then the same thing with some products, we went back and forth. Even though we did so much on the computer with this project and the deck grew and grew as we kept going, I feel like we always would, once you do a sample, once you make the real thing, we'd send packages back and forth and review together. And in some of these patterns, I feel like once we got to the real thing, the scale became quite apparent of what we liked and what we.
In a pattern like this one, it's got every one of them has a story. Every one of them, has a little kind of like, I think, insider ha-ha moment. And that one was, we saw birds in the sky flying, and you'd take a photograph of like a swarm of birds, and you'd see these dots, and you'd be able to say, oh yeah, I get it here. But then we had, we use Gatorboard as a pinup board, and we often are using tacks to pin things up, and you pin up fabric samples, pin up all kinds of things. And we had cleared a board off that had been pinned on many times, and you saw this dot pattern on it. And it was this abstracted dot pattern, and they were like, look, it's the birds, it's the pattern, and so a lot of these, you find accidentally, there were times when we were getting dappled light that was coming in the studio through a tree that was outside, and you could see this pattern, on our wall and on our floor of the shadows from the trees. And, it was the pattern again. And so it's these things that you would start to see reoccur in other locations accidentally, but, I guess on purpose, that those things are supposed to happen, and they do. And when you can identify them and then pull from that to put it into something that's repeatable, and you can weave into a thing like this, it's nice. I mean, I like having the story, but I also like the thing without the story. I like when you see this in a bolt of fabric and applied to something, it's really, really beautiful.
Catherine, what are we looking at here? What part of the process is evidenced here?
Yeah, so once we kind of landed on our, various things that we wanted to explore, we started pulling them together because we still want the whole collection to feel cohesive, and the color story and the color work point of view that Coalesse had put together, we wanted to make sure we captured that across. So these are all little, when you're developing fabric, you often, have a little tiny swatch, and that's all you have until you have like a warehouse full. So these are our lab dips. And as we went through and identified the constructions, we would, if it was a piece dyed or a woven, we'd either have our little piece dyes, so you can have whatever color you want. So we could get really specific. Like on the slide before, there were all these different pinks. We were like trying to hit the exact, pink and red that we wanted. With a yarn dyed, you're using existing yarn, so you're maybe yarn colors, you're a little more constrained, although usually you have quite a few. So then we would lay out all of our lab dips, a set in San Francisco, a set in New York, lay them out and kind of step back and look at the whole grouping together, in these little like 2-inch square swatches. Then that helped us to look at what are the options. And then of course, again, whittle down and edit to what we want to move forward with as the standard offering, which is always, you always have your favorites that you advocate for, or colors that you discuss. This pattern, we wanted to do a light and a dark of the color combinations. And then so you'll see the only thing that breaks the rule in this color line is the yellow. And we did a light yellow. And then when we were all talking together, we all kind of agreed. We're like, okay, we're going to break our own rule. This light yellow isn't doing it for us. So
it doesn't have to be dogma.
It's just a collaboration and conversation.
Yeah, we made rules, but then we could also break our own rules if it didn't make sense.
What I think is nice about the final collection is it's not kind of matchy, but it's very kind of, all the colors have sympathy towards one another. So John, when you're thinking with your team about your furniture in place in situ, can you speak a little bit about how you see the color stories working together, or what you would, what would make you happy to see in a space somehow?
Well, I think that, what we strive for is some variety, some diversity in nature, some of those things that you experience around you, and that it isn't what you said, which is the same thing repeated over and over, and that repetition becomes banal. It just becomes, grayness. And, when you can have things that have a similarity, yet don't feel like there is no visual interest and contrast between them, I think is what we're looking for. And you see that a lot in the things that we do, and you can find ways of finding things that do complement each other, that work, within the either kind of valuation or contrast that you're going for, and that those patterns, like Catherine was saying, you can combine. Yeah, here it is. You can have a micro and a macro together, and the light thread in the macro is the background color of the micro, and then the dark thread is the background color of the macro here. And it's a thing that I think is surprising, and I love surprise. I always talk about surprise and delight. There's these things where you look at something, you're like, wow, that looks like it's going to be really hard and uncomfortable, and you sit on it and you're like, wow, it's incredibly comfortable. And that surprise and delight is what we look for in not only the physical aspect but the visual aspect. And so how you can combine these things in ways that when we walk in and go, oh wow, that is a very nice way of using those together, versus the same color just painted across a whole room, and that is the new version of a, old school cubicle or something that, obviously I think we've all evolved from.
Yeah, it's nice to see them all together.
And we started making pillows with them. You could really see ways that, then these fabrics could be used in combinations that I don't think we had thought about when we first started the project. And I think that's also a nice thing that I've found, is that as you get deeper into a project, you start to see more opportunity for it. You see more ways that you can use that thing. And you thought, oh, it's going to be X. And it became X plus Y and a little bit of Z. And then that's what I really love, is like, oh, we never imagined we would get this from it. And we did. And those are the kind of projects that I think at the end you really celebrate. Yeah.
So did you, given that this was a pre-pandemic project and you were doing everything remotely, what things did you learn that prepared you for working on product development remotely during the pandemic? Any learnings there?
I love Google Docs. The way we kind of used the deck, I feel like in this project was, I feel like I repeated the format just because you can drop in pictures or the idea of virtually casually sharing, the presentation, the deck isn't the deliverable, but you can collaborate visually by just dropping things in or moving them around. I think was something I learned from this project that I still, work that way now because of it.
I never would have imagined that we would move to where we are now, that we have gone through what we just went through or are still going through, and that we were kind of early days on trying to understand how to collaborate in the way that we work. And so in so many ways, I think we were just kind of lucky and, ahead of ourselves. And we did train ourselves a little bit on now how to work better, in the ways that we're working right now. I think one of the things that I realized, and I've had it a couple times, with working with different regions, is it's easier to work vertically than it is horizontally. And what I mean by that is the time zone differences were probably one of the greater challenges for us than the technology itself. It's often, as you work from East Coast to West Coast, or let's say West Coast to Europe, or East Coast to Asia, it's the horizontal difference in time zones that's tougher to navigate than if you work from, say, New York to Florida, or Washington to California, or even California to Brazil. As you go straight down and you can stay in these time zones, it's almost easier because you get more time with people, and you can really, the technology allows us to have a call with Brazil as easy as it does New York. And it's just whether the people are still awake, or whether they've woken up yet. And I think that as we all now are getting better at trying to navigate scheduling, I think that to me is where we're going, is we're going to do more of this kind of stuff. And we just got to experiment it a little bit earlier than most people.
Catherine, wasn't one of the mills you were working with was in Italy? So again, extending that time band pretty dramatically between the West Coast and the mills in Italy. But I do remember the owner of the mill kept sending you images for scale with, his hand or a stapler or something, so that you could say, to talk a little bit about that. That was actually a very good way of working, just to say, okay, how can I put the scale into context?
Yeah, well, and I feel like also, just being able to snap things with your phone really quickly and share them in something. So yeah, with the time difference, and you always one day off, but you wake up to like pictures of Fabiano's hands and a stapler. And is this the right, line weight? Is this what you were talking about? Like, you could still, it makes that distance easier to bridge, I think, with all of these tools. But yeah, the time is the time. So if they're like, oh, nope, sorry, it finished weaving, like your feedback wasn't, on time, that's just the reality of it, too late. So, but no, I feel like that, at least for visual projects, I think other types of work, maybe that's how they've always worked, but I think having the ability to just snap pictures and in this more casual way, you kind of get a sense in real time-ish you know, what the other person is looking at or what they want your feedback on or an idea that they have.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you'd heard a lot of IT people, programmers working in these kind of virtual ways where, because they were writing code and they could be in the kind of code together, that they could be remote. And, when we were so physical, often we're making things you have to touch and see, and you really want to be together and experiencing in the same light and being able to have those types of conversations. It didn't seem as like, as I was brought up and as I think about my training, it didn't seem like the way that you would think about working. You wanted to be in front of those things and really together with others collaborating on those things. And so I wouldn't have thought that it would have worked as easily or as well as it did, being virtual and being so separated. Yet we found a way. And I think the other thing that we did is we augmented the distance with samples. And so we would send samples back and forth. And so as we had lab dips or as we had, new weavings, we would get these little squares sent to us that we could be looking at the same thing at the same time to then be able to say, hey, in the document, we're putting this on this, and then are you looking at that too? And so we could have a video conference with a document that was digital, but with samples that were physical. And it's the combination of all of those things that seem to make it work.
Yeah, definitely. So we have loads of great questions, so I'm going to jump over to those. Thanks to both of you for a great conversation. So let's just jump in with the questions. Let's see. Do you do all the patterns on the computer, or do you craft and experience by hand?
I would go back and forth, actually.
It's
It's a great question. And I would say we took a lot of photographs. We had a lot of things that we then would, use the computer to manipulate the photograph into a digital pattern. And then we would, print it and play with the scale of it and draw on top of it and then rescan it. And so there was a lot of manipulation back and forth between the analog and digital. But at the end, it was all digital.
Yeah, that's interesting the way you say that, John. It's true. It does end up in a digital format. Looms are run by computers. That's just the reality of things. But I think going back and forth, you can often always tell if something starts and ends in a computer. Digitally, I think if you have things that go back and forth with hand done or photographic or more, you can't. It shows, I think, if it's just always starts and ends in the computer. So that intervention early on of something by hand is meaningful.
And I think that that's the important thing to understand is that even though it was done by a computer or done in the computer, once it's being woven by hand, on a loom or, even if a machine is, doing this weaving, it still isn't perfect like, in a computer. When you print something, it kind of comes out the same over and over and over. But when it's woven, it's not. There is a tolerance that's higher, and so even though you think in your mind the pattern's going to be perfect and it will be exactly the same, it's not. And somebody stretches the fabric a little bit more or a little bit less, and all of a sudden the pattern's a little bit wider, a little bit different. And that's, I think, part of the art and beauty of the thing as well, is that it's imperfect. And even though, you can make it as perfect as possible.
Speaking our language.
Yeah, nature's not perfect. And that's partly what we were trying to do, is pull from nature. And so it seemed even more natural.
Follow on to that point. The question is, do you think that people are nervous about imperfection because it's difficult to explain to guests or users, I guess, or even the fact that they should be explaining just to make clear the design intent or idea?
I think that
Question.
we're historically very used to seeing the hand in something, and that things take a patina through use, that they come with imperfection, sometimes depending on how they're made, and that it's meeting one's expectations that's the most important. And so if you buy, let's say, a precision instrument like a new phone or something, you kind of expect certain things to be very precise in meeting up with each other in exacting ways. Whereas when things are soft, like if you buy a shirt or you buy things that you can tell were made by somebody, I don't think you have the same expectation of it. And I think it's that expectation that people want to have marry up. And when it doesn't marry up, that there's the frustration. But when you can actually add the surprise and delight, I think it takes it to another level. And so it's like, I can look at something and actually think I know what it's going to be like. And when that experience exceeds what my expectation was, then it's worth that much more. Whereas it's when I buy something and I think, oh, the phone's going to be perfect, and it gets there and all the parts aren't fitting up to each other, that you're let down because your expectation was they would fit up and yet they don't. If your expectations, they don't fit up and they do perfectly, then you're like, wow, look at the quality of this thing. It's all the pieces fit up perfectly. I never thought they would. And so I think we're always striving to the side of saying, let's set the expectation and let's exceed that expectation. And when you do that, I think you delight users and consumers.
And I think some of it goes back to when you were talking about the kind of quality of textiles. You know, it's not an extruded plastic, it's not metal, it's not, it is, you know, a little bit more of an art than a science. And so while we have, you know, if you're using natural fibers or using like a process like matelassé where the fabric kind of shrinks up in the heat and you're not going to control exactly where each pleat is, you know, that's the beauty of the fabric. So maybe to a, you know, in a quality inspection, that could be, oh, this is different. But I think in the end user, if it feels like a mistake to the end user, that's not good. But if it feels like it's made the material richer or plays into the quality, like linen is not always perfectly flat. But that's the beauty of linen. So I think, yeah, if it seems like a mistake at the end, then maybe you did something wrong. But
but you want the materials to do the talking, right? So letting them do what they do best is important. Let's see. You mentioned recyclability. How does it work? Is there any process in place to mitigate waste? It's a big question.
It is a big question. Well, I can, from the textile side, mitigating waste is a good point to bring up. I feel like we have a few, there's like different points along the way. So from our material selection and our ingredient selection, we have control over that. So utilizing yarns that are built off of existing waste streams, like the recycled plastics, are things we do as often as we can. So if we are using polyester, we try to always use that. With the loop-to-loop construction, we've tried to optimize that and make it even more meaningful and expand the waste stream that fiber comes from. A couple of the products in this collection use a yarn that's made in Spain out of fashion industry waste. So it's using old like seconds of t-shirts from t-shirt manufacturing. So it's a cotton yarn, but it has some other materials added to it to make it strong and constitute a new. So we're always looking for things like that. I think the challenge of our industry is what happens after the material leaves our hands. I think that's something has a lot of room for improvement and infrastructure that doesn't quite exist as far as reclaiming the end product. But we try to be as conscious as we can about what we put into our products.
Yeah, and then in the production,
it's a small, only answers a small part of the question.
Yeah, and so then the next step of that is in the production, what we really work hard to do is leverage the computers to help us understand how to lay out our patterns, how to nest those patterns on a bolt of fabric to where it eliminates as much waste as possible. And so you have as little scrap. You're really trying to fit the pieces together in a little puzzle-like way that allows them to still have the marrying of the patterns and meeting how it will be sewn in the right ways, and have as little leftover as possible. And then we're also leveraging techniques like not gluing things so that after life they can still be separated and taken back to be recycled. We use cradle to cradle thinking and McDonough-Brungard kind of methodologies of saying, hey, what's the end of life that this thing can have. We work with the University of Michigan and talking about how the material chemistry of something is very important, and that idea of being able to get things back, from a polymer back to a monomer, and then being able to use those materials to make new materials again. And so, that idea of recyclability and sustainability and renewability, and how we manage those materials that we're leveraging to not only create the fabrics, but then the products and then back again, is really important, I think, to both of our companies, as you know. And so reducing waste, I think, is core to what we do and what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think also both Steelcase and Designtex also look at the business as a whole, and looking at ways we can optimize all the things that we're doing, just even beyond material selection and production. So as an example, Designtex has operated carbon neutral for the last 11 years. So there are, lots of ways you can look at the problem kind of holistically. So let's see. Here's a question. How does a pattern with volume work differently than a flat fabric?
Any of the patterns is tricky as you upholster, because what we're always trying to do is, if you imagine how, nice fashion is done, or, how when you're sewing something, you're trying to get the lines of something to come together in a way where it looks like the fabric is almost continuation, the pattern is almost continuation. And it's when the fabric is just sewn in a way where you can see they're misaligned, that it's that difference in quality, and it's the little details that your eyes pick up and kind of vibrate or can disturb you. And so dimensionally, as you're trying to get that to happen, it's a little bit more of a challenge, but it's really the same thing. I think dimensionally it's trickier because often we have so much more material that we're trying to sew together, and you get salvage that shows up and it telegraphs through the surface, because there's a lot more material kind of underneath there, in the seams, like in a shirt. There's a lot more stuff that's kind of on the skin side of your shirt, and it's not often a pleasant or great detail in upholstery. And so we're always trying to minimize or limit the amount of salvage, or trying to find ways to hide it so that the thing still seems kind of continuous and flat and deliberate in how it's made. And when something's dimensional, that's a greater challenge. That's the bigger challenge, I think, for us.
And also the light must be a big factor too. It's just as you see the material going over a curve or over another surface. That's another factor, I would imagine.
Yeah.
But anyway, we have one last question, which is, what are your last words of advice for the students?
For me, it's be curious, ask a lot of questions, try and understand as much as possible. I mean, I learned a ton through this process. I've been in the furniture industry a long time, and I feel like every project I'm still learning new things and being surprised every day. I felt like I understood palettes and what we were trying to do, and then when I started working with Designtex and really getting into how things are constructed and made, I didn't know anything. And so what you learn is, when you start working with people who know what they're doing on things, there's a lot that you don't know. And so what I would say to a student is, say yes to everything that you're offered an opportunity to be a part of, so that you can learn more. Be super curious and just try and learn as much as possible, because it'll help your designs be better. It'll help you take that knowledge and apply it into other ways that maybe others haven't done yet, or that you thought you would ever. And so just ask a lot of questions and experiment like crazy, and be curious.
Good answer. Yeah, I was gonna say, just be open. I feel like what we all went to school with, maybe our degrees and our areas of studies, may not have aligned with what we do today. But and I'm like a shy person, but it's like you said, John, when you find people who know about things that you don't, or have a path that's something you didn't even know was an option, don't be afraid to kind of just learn from them, and be open to all of these different niches of the design industry that exist.
All great advice. Well, thank you so much for coming on today to share these insights and more about this project. Students, thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to learn more about this amazing project, you can visit the links that are provided in the chat, as well as Designtex and Coalesce's websites. If you want to learn more about Be Original Americas, you can visit beoriginalamerica's.com. Well, Susan, Catherine, John, another huge thank you. We appreciate it. And students, we will see you on the next one.
Thanks for having me. See you guys.
Thanks, everyone.